If you are in New York City or East Hampton or Martha's Vineyard or parts of Connecticut or Lawrence, Massachusetts, or any number of places that were known to Leonard Bernstein, who will be one of the topics of discussion today. Good evening to people listening in Vienna and all over Europe. Special love, as always, to our loved ones in Ukraine. We are with you. We send you love and greetings to people all around the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. I have been especially looking forward to speaking to today's guest, who is Jamie Bernstein, author of a fantastic book, Famous Father Girl, a memoir of growing up Bernstein. She is the daughter of Leonard Bernstein, one of the daughters of Leonard Bernstein. We are people who surely overlapped in many different places. We don't really know one another, but I've certainly respected her work and knew her father for a long period. And Jamie, I'm going to start by welcoming you by saying something particular. Every week on this program, since Russia invaded Ukraine back in February, we've sent out a special greetings to people in awareness of people in Ukraine and what they're enduring. Leonard Bernstein's parents were from Ukraine, and my grandparents on one side were from Ukraine. If you can, talk about that experience. You knew your grandparents and how whatever being Ukrainian may have informed his outlook, their outlook, your outlook.
Well, first of all, hi, Fred, and everybody who's joining us. This is really fun, and I'm delighted to be here. And thanks for the shout out for my book. I appreciate that so much. And as for Ukraine, you know, it's a little complicated. Yes, my father's parents, Sam and Jenny, were both from Ukraine, one from what is now called Rivne, but used to be called Rovno and became part of a lyric in Candide. My father came from Rovno Gubernia, in I am easily assimilated, right? And then my grandmother, Jenny's family, came from a town called Horowitz. K-O-R-E-T-S is how they always spelled it. And you know, you can still find these two towns on a current map of the Ukraine. They're just spelled a little different now. But when the war broke out there, when the Russians invaded, I was curious to look into where these towns were, and I was astonished to find that they are absolutely in the center of Ukraine. In the days when my grandparents were growing up there, it was kind of part of Russia, and the north of Ukraine was kind of mixed in with Poland. And so, as usual, that whole area was kind of nebulous when it came to what it was called, whom it belonged to. It was always kind of a question mark. And the other question mark, of course, is that both of my grandparents fled Ukraine because of the pogroms against the Jewish people who were living in the shtetls. And my grandfather came over here at age 17, all by himself on steerage without a coin in his pocket, the classic immigrant, ultimately success story, because he wound up thriving. He started his own hair and beauty supply business in Boston. And he was introduced through relatives and other people from Ukraine to Jenny Resnick, whom he subsequently married. And they had 3 kids, the eldest of which was Lenny, or nay Lewis. Did you know that was his name on the birth certificate?
Yeah.
And then, but nobody ever called him Lewis except on the very first day of school when the teacher was going through the roll call. And then he would explain that everybody called him Leonard and you can call me Lenny. And then on his 18th birthday, he drove up to Lawrence, Massachusetts, his birthplace, found his records and changed his name officially on his birth certificate.
Today,
you know, the connection to Ukraine is what I was getting at.
Sure.
Is complicated because they had to flee Ukraine because they were being persecuted as Jews. So I'm imagining, although I never talked to my grandparents about it, but their sentiments about their motherland were probably ambivalent.
As were mine. It was kind of like, we're glad we learned Yiddish with good riddance to that place because it was nothing but serious problems. Today is August 19th of 2020, and I have a good date memory, and I realized that 2 days ago, my grandfather was born in Kyiv 140 years ago. And I found a picture of him, and both my grandparents were urban Ukrainians. My grandmother was from Odessa and my grandfather from Kyiv, and both impeccably stylish people. Not that they necessarily had a lot of money, but appearance and good looks and grooming and so on were incredibly important to them. And they passed that down to the children, and it got a little lost. Well, I mean, I care about it too, but my mother is famously fashionable, and her siblings were too. And they were cosmopolitan Ukrainians, my grandparents, and lived it very differently, in that my grandmother always apparently spoke of the elegance of the women of Odessa, the sense of humor of the people of Odessa.
Wow.
And my grandmother famously had a great sense of humor. My grandfather famously did not have a great sense of humor, which meant that the jokes fell flat at home. But it's a bit about timing, and it's a bit about how the rhythm of speech and so on is informed. And I bring this up because Leonard Bernstein, among the many qualities that he's known for, one that he very famously was known for, at least to those who knew him, was he was very verbal. He was very good at language. He cared deeply about written language, spoken language. In your book, you talk about how there was sort of a family language that was a part. It was not Yiddish. It was just Bernsteinish, I guess. It had a name. I forget what the name was that the family
spoke. Called, it's true. It was a secret language that he made up with his neighbor in his neighborhood, Eddie Ryak.
That's right.
And so they imagined this country called Rye-Bernia, which was a portmanteau of their names, Rye from Ryak and Bern from Bernstein. And in Rye-Bernia, everyone spoke Rye-Bernian, and they sort of kind of made up this language, which wasn't really a thorough language. It didn't have a grammar, and there were certain things you could say in Rye-Bernian with gusto. And the language was really very rudely derived from the way the old people from the old country spoke with their funny accents. And many of them had speech impediments and sinus conditions and also spoke very loudly. So the whole language, such as it was all about pronouncing things through your nose and very loudly, and it was a very exuberant, crazy language, which luckily was passed along to my brother and sister and me. And we don't know all the ins and outs of it, but we still say certain words to each other in Rye-Bernian, and it gives us a great sense of kinship going through the generations.
Would you mind, unless you have a copy of the book right at hand, if I were to read a little passage from your book? Unless you'd like to. Okay.
Please be my guest.
Okay. It's the very beginning of the book. The story goes that when my brother was born, Henry the Dachshund and I were both so outraged by the intrusion that we jointly peed on my mother's pillow. Nor was I consoled a year later as I warily watched Alexander pull himself to his feet. Was this little interloper going to walk now too? But as soon as Alexander could talk, I realized what the point of a brother was. We became conspirators, eventually expanding into a trio with our younger sister, Nina. Together, we created a force field around ourselves, a layer of insulation from the raucous, confusing world of our parents. But there was something seductive about that world too, with its laughter and teasing, its music, theater, and books, the screaming parlor games, the elegance of smoking. That is such a improbably wonderful start for a book that could have gone in so many directions, and yet it says so much. When I was reading it again recently, it felt to me like a kaleidoscope, that we had the facts, we had the protagonist, but if you turn the kaleidoscope slightly, you got a different view. I think one of the great achievements of your book is that it was beautifully reported if you had been a journalist or a reporter. And there was a lot of emotion there, but it was not about the emotion, if you know what I mean. The emotion was there. The family sense was there. The struggles that inevitably happen in a family were there, but the love was also there. And I felt that there was a real understanding on your part as the writer of the people involved, and you didn't gloss over their imperfections, but nor did it become a tell-all, if you know what I mean. It was a story of a family life and the sense of conspirators in a good way. The women from Chile who were part of the family unit who took care of the children, while your mother, who was Chilean, and your father lived their public lives as an actress, as a musician, as a teacher, as Mrs. Maestro in the case of your mother on occasions, and the whole world that surrounded them, this world of famous buildings, the Osborne on West 57th Street, a home on Park Avenue, later the Dakota, the famous building on the west side, very close to where I grew up. Someone once described a woman I know who works in the arts, that she doesn't so much drop a name as hurl them to the ground. And I never felt in your book that you were doing that. Yes, you were surrounded by very famous figures such as the director Mike Nichols, Lauren Bacall. I could name many as you could too. But in the book, they were there to serve a purpose. They were there to explain your formation, your parents' lives and their inspirations and their challenges. And often this kind of book can feel very vicarious or a little rude, but this was the tone was perfect, which is why, on second reading, I don't read too many books the second time because there are so many books that I want to read the first time, but it was a delight to go back into it again and discover that. Did you set out to do that? Did it just happen? How did you arrive at that lead of the arrival of your brother, of all the people you could have described as the start of the book?
Yeah, it was a funny place to start, wasn't it? And a little rude, peeing together on our mother's pillow, me and Henry. But first of all, in our family, funniness, jokes, and humor are absolutely of prime importance. And so it was not a coincidence that the book began with a zinger, if you will. But then the other thing that I was very consciously intending to do was to begin by painting a portrait of my family as I perceived it back then. So the first chapter or so, it is all from the point of view of how a very young child perceives the world. So I relied on sensory observations. It was about the smell of things and the way things looked and misunderstandings I had about language. And and also to convey that this world I lived in, this family was not just the nuclear family, but this gigantic swirling blob, as they themselves call themselves, blob of friends who were always getting together and having this very wonderful, happy, noisy time. And when my brother and I used to go to sleep, I think I described this in the book, when we were very young, we shared a bedroom and we could hear the grown-ups carrying on downstairs just as we were trying to go to sleep. And we could hear the roaring of songs around the piano and screaming with laughter over all their parlor games, the word games and the charades, and we could hear the clinking of the glasses, and the cigarette smoke was drifting up from downstairs too. There was no escaping it ever. And so it all just seemed so incredibly fun and glamorous. We thought all grown-ups did was have fun. We couldn't wait to be grown-ups. We just thought that was going to be a blast, to be part of all that singing and game playing and carrying on. And it took me some years before I began to realize that being a grown-up was slightly more complicated than I had imagined. I actually date it to one particular day that I realized, oh, this whole thing about being in the grown-up world is a lot more complicated than I thought. And that was on November 22nd, 1963, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It was so horrific. And my parents and all those relatives and friends were so devastated. And it was the first time I'd ever seen that the grown-ups being upset. I'd never seen grown-ups cry really until that day. And then they were all crying. And it was so shocking. And it was such an eye-opener. That was when I realized, okay, there's more to this than I thought.
Well, as a bit of background, because a lot of this is available on video on YouTube and elsewhere, the Kennedy White House was much more open to the arts and the artists than had been most of the others previously. John F. Kennedy understood that, but it was really Jacqueline Kennedy who fostered it. And so that it was very common to see your father performing there, introducing a little boy cellist named Yo-Yo Ma. That video is very famous. But the White House under the Kennedys was open to the arts and understood the role of the arts in society. So if I recall correctly, after John Kennedy was assassinated, your father had a relationship with CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System, and Columbia Records at that time. And he was able to present the New York Philharmonic playing Mahler's Symphony No. 2 Resurrection as something commemorative for the death of John F. Kennedy. Apart from anything else, I don't think we could ever imagine a conductor summoning that nowadays if such a tragedy were to happen again.
Well, let's hope we don't have to find out.
Yes, but I
you're
think
right. I mean, you're right.
Of a different value system back then than we have now.
It wasn't only the value system in the White House, although that was a huge part of it. And I think you're right that it was Jacqueline Kennedy herself who had that real aesthetic sensibility and kind of spearheaded all of that. But I think it's also because of the times that we were living in back then. You know how after World War II, everybody said about the business of joining the middle class, and there was a big premium on getting culture, and people would buy opera records and listen to the opera on Saturdays and learn about literature and art and music in general, and classical music had more of a cachet back then than it does now in the general population. And that's why the other good piece of timing for my dad was that he proposed to put his young people's concert with the New York Philharmonic on television. And today, you could never get a young people's concert with the New York Philharmonic on primetime television on the CBS network. It's unthinkable. But back then, people were really interested in that kind of stuff. Plus, it was the early days of television, and there weren't that many channels, and there wasn't enough content. The three networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, were all starved for content. And so they were only too happy to put young people's concerts on television briefly at prime time and then later on like Sunday or Saturday afternoons. And they totally found their audience because people were really, the parents thought it would be good for their children to learn about classical music because that's where the priorities were back then. And the other thing, and I love telling young people today about this, is that back then there was one screen in every household, one screen. And I love asking the kids, so how many screens do you have in your household? Go ahead, count them up. You have to count, all the TV monitors and all the laptops and the tablets and the phones. And have you run out of fingers yet? And often they have. Mm-hmm. And it's a great way to explain how different the world was back then. The whole family sat down together, multiple generations, sat down together in front of that single hulking TV console in the living room, and they all watched the programming together because there was just the one screen. So you had to share. And as a result, millions of people of all ages tuned into these young people's concerts. And I'm guessing that Leonard Bernstein single-handedly turned more people on to symphonic music than anyone else in history because of the television broadcasts.
And he was a fabulous teacher, but I want to get into that in a bit. I want to tell you now how I first came across him, or he came across me. In 1962, the first building of Lincoln Center opened. Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, for people who know Leonard Bernstein's and Sondheim's and Lawrence West Side Story, it's set in a neighborhood where ultimately those buildings were taken down, and they built a performing arts center, the first really. The groundbreaking was May 14th of 1959 with Leontyne Price and Dwight D. Eisenhower, then president, digging in the shovels to start building Lincoln Center.
I remember watching that on that hulking television in our library.
And the first building to open was called Philharmonic Hall at that time, to be the home for the New York Philharmonic. It meant that the Philharmonic was leaving its home at Carnegie Hall across the street from where you grew up, basically, in the Osborne. And initially, Carnegie Hall was threatened with destruction. Thank God it was saved, effort led by Isaac Stern and many others, but he really was the one who led the fight for it. It's inconceivable now to think that they would tear those down, but they tore down the beautiful Pennsylvania Station in New York. Yes, they were tearing down landmarks, and Mrs. Kennedy, in fact, became a leader in landmark preservation. But my mother was hired by Lincoln Center at that time, or what would become Lincoln Center, to work in the Department of Public Information. And her office was situated across the street. If you remember John's Coffee Shop and the Cinema Studio on 66th Street, right above that were Lincoln Center's offices. And we kids, and I was a toddler then, there was no such thing as daycare. And the children of parents of Lincoln Center all sat in the lobby of Philharmonic Hall being looked after by a guard, and we would have coloring books and our snacks and so on. And one day, this handsome man with silver hair and a black cape swept through and with a deep voice said, "Who are these children?" And we were all petrified. And the guard said, "Well, Maestro, these are the children of Lincoln Center employees. Why are they in the lobby? Bring them into the theater." And from that point forward, for rehearsals, for certain performances and so on, when the timing coincided, I was part of a group of children who watched Leonard Bernstein rehearse the New York Philharmonic. He, over his left shoulder, would turn and explain to us what, Brahms meant this. I remember the first thing I learned was the Brahms Second Symphony. Brahms intended this, and you want to listen for that. And from the very beginning, I and this little group were trained by Leonard Bernstein in music and listening. And this went on for 2 years.
That's the most privileged thing I ever heard in my life.
It was phenomenal. And then years later, because I saw him intermittently through the years, I told him about that. And he said, "Well, I used all of you as a focus group for what would work for the children's concerts, young people's concerts, and what didn't quite connect with you." And he said, "If I found a word that all of you responded to, I would work that word into my lecture for the young people's concert." So that's how I first met what was to me then Maestro Bernstein, and not Lenny, although everyone eventually would call him Lenny, even if they were not intimates of it. He just was known as Lenny.
Right. Well, so we're fellow guinea pigs, because my brother and sister and I played the same role for my dad, where he would sort of test things on us.
Mm-hmm.
And
so needless to say, I will add just very briefly that I had a relative for a time who was an arts and repertoire executive at Columbia Records at a time when Leonard Bernstein, the New York Philharmonic, and many artists were recording, and therefore your father and mother were occasionally at our house. And I cooked because I'm a good cook even as a kid. And so I cooked for Leonard Bernstein, for Eugene Ormandy, who always said, not enough paprika. Whenever I would add, not enough paprika, he was Hungarian, of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And so that's, again, how I knew your father, in the circle of people of which he had many, 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 many circles. And occasionally I would run into him. There was a restaurant for many years called the Café des Artistes on West 67th Street. And one time he came in, black cape. I happened to be there waiting for a table, and he looked at me. And for people who knew the restaurant, I think the artist's name was Duncan Chandler Christie, something like that, who painted rather provocative near nudes, mostly blonde nymphs and handsome guys. And by then I was working at the Metropolitan Opera, and your father turned to me and he said, "You think he could be Siegfried?" Of this rather handsome, blonde, almost naked hero, and surrounded by three little nymphs who were probably the Rhine maidens. And so he was visible in New York, is really the point that I want to say. He was not a recluse artist. I can name others of his stature almost. I'll say a name, James Levine. James Levine basically lived his musician's life. And occasionally you'd see him at a performance by Lane Stritch or in a restaurant, but very quietly. But James Levine was, and I worked for him, was not the public figure beyond the musician that your father was. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, my father hated being alone. He was the most gregarious person on the planet. He loved people, all people. He loved everybody from, the elevator operator to the cab driver to, the proverbial little old lady who swept up the stage. He was just everybody's pal and could strike up a conversation with anyone. And what was really hard for him, hardest of all, was to be all alone in his studio at 4 a.m. composing all by himself. It was torture for him. And I suspect that's one of the reasons he was so drawn to writing for the theater, for musical theater, ballet, opera, Broadway, because then you have collaborators and you're not all alone all the time. You can run things by other people, and there's a back and forth thing going on. And I think he just craved that. He hated being alone. So
I want to get
that's
back.
Why he was out on the town too. And he was so curious about everything. That was the other thing.
True.
It was why he was such a good teacher, because he was so fascinated by everything. And the minute something really excited him, he had to turn right around and share it with everybody else.
So actually, since you're talking about teacher, you wrote in the book, I'm looking for the quote directly, but in effect, there simply was no moment when Leonard Bernstein wasn't being a teacher. And then another point, you used a term I love, relentless pedagogy. And
it was.
Does that become a bit much?
Yes, it did. I mean, it's a wonderful problem to be having. So I can't really complain too much, but it is, my sister Nina makes the joke that you had to be really careful about what question you asked our dad, because if it was too juicy a question, you might get an hour-long answer and you'd be stuck there, getting this lecture on whatever the subject was that he just warmed right up to. So, and the slightest thing could set him off, and then all of a sudden you'd be getting, a big exegesis on some topic or other.
But in the book, I think you indicate or suggest that it sometimes exhausted your mother and maybe other people too, because he could be so effusive in his passion for sharing knowledge It was not a show off. It was just a passion for sharing
No,
knowledge.
no, it was genuine enthusiasm,
Yeah.
but it was a little exhausting. And can you imagine being married to that? I mean, it was tough enough to have him for a dad, but we could escape into our own lives. But if you're married to him, I mean, there you are. So the story our mother told, which I think might be in the book, was about their honeymoon drive to Mexico.
Yes, it was in the
where
book.
my father and my mother was from Chile in South America. She spoke excellent English, but you know, she wasn't all the way up on her rules of English grammar. So my father decided that as an activity on the way to Mexico on their honeymoon, they were driving across country, and he decided to teach her the rules of English grammar, if you can imagine anything less romantic. And my mother said, you know, every morning they'd get back in that car and my father would say, well, you remember in yesterday's lesson, and her heart would sink. It's amazing the marriage survived that trip, honestly.
But actually, now that I think about it, you describe in the book that one time he and you were together in a car, and apparently he was a dreadful driver. Do you know if your dad or your mother drove down to Mexico or both? Because
you know what? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm guessing that they took turns because my mother was a really good driver.
Yeah.
My father was not, but he was the guy and he loved driving. So I'm sure he was behind the wheel at least half the time, if not more than that. But he was—
Talk about, if you would, about his often being nearly arrested in Connecticut for his driving problems.
This was, you know, my mother's ongoing frustration and annoyance was that she was the one who always seemed to get pinched and got the speeding ticket, while her husband just got away with it all the time. On the few occasions when he would be pulled over, he would just kind of charm his way out of the ticket because, you know, he was that guy and he was such a celebrity. Everybody knew who he was because he was on television. Everybody watched television, and everybody knew, therefore, who Leonard Bernstein was. Even if they were not music fans, they still knew who he was. He was a giant celebrity in those days. And that's why my book is called Famous Father Girl, because my classmate Lisa in second grade called me that to tease me, famous father girl, because everybody knew who he was. He was famous.
Which leads me to ask a question that exists in your book, but I would like to ask it further, maybe relating to your brother and sister as well, but especially to you. Forming your own identity and interest when you have two such prominent parents. Your mother was an actress and beautiful and socially admired, and although she was not the world's most famous maestro, she was a person of considerable glamour and substance as well, and had people who admired her and clung to her as well. But within that context, it certainly sounds you like, while the children were taken upstairs and had a nanny and a cook from Chile, that you were showered with love. But nonetheless, when having these famous parents, there are many stories of children of famous parents who have trouble adjusting to that or finding their own way. And you did. It probably required hit and miss and trial and error. And to the degree that you'd like to talk about it, when did you become aware that you needed your own identity and that you were not only a famous father girl, but you were Jamie on your own?
Right. Well, this is pretty much what the book is about.
Yeah.
Is how I was able to get to the point where I would think it was funny to call my book Famous Father Girl and not be self-conscious about that, you know, and it took a long, long time. And I made things exponentially harder on myself by trying to make a career as a singer-songwriter for many years. I went out to LA and I was, you know, making demo tapes as one did back in the day, shopping them around, looking for a manager in a record company and doing all that stuff. And in the end, I set it aside. It didn't really work out. And at that point, I got married and started having my kids, making my own family. And I still was not at all sure who I was and for what reason I was on the planet. And it really happened by accident that a few years after my father died, so we're now into the 1990s, I'm raising my kids with my husband, David, and we suddenly, my brother and sister and I, suddenly found ourselves the owners of the Leonard Bernstein Company, and we were suddenly the caretakers of his legacy, a thing we had never thought about while he was alive, never. We couldn't have cared less. We were just, he was daddy, you know, and we would just do all the daddy things with him, play word games, eat corn on the cob, go swimming. You know, we went to his concerts, and sometimes we tagged along when he was on the road, and all of that was very fun. Mm-hmm. But we related to him not as the illustrious maestro, but as our very genuinely earthy dad. And he loved having us around. We never felt unwelcome in his presence. And so his whole persona when he was alive was very accessible to us. Then he was gone. And we were suddenly taking care of his legacy. Where are his archives going to go? What do we do with his works, and how will they endure in the world? All that stuff. And somewhere in through there, his music licensor, Boozy and Hawkes, came to us with this idea. Hey, how would it be if somebody would invent a young people's concert, just like the ones Bernstein used to do on television, except about him and his music? And wouldn't that be a great package to offer to all the American orchestras for their education programs? And wouldn't it be also a nice way to promote the Bernstein catalog? And we all said, yeah, that's a great idea. And for some reason I will never understand, my hand went up and I volunteered to develop this concert. And I don't know why I thought I could do it. I just somehow felt like I could. But of course I wasn't a conductor, was I? Nor could I drift over to the piano and do little, you know, demos like my father used to do. So I divided the job in half, and I got my friend, the conductor, Michael Barrett, who had studied with my father and was his assistant conductor for many years. I said, Mikey, he was by now like a family friend. Mikey, you do the music part and I'll write the script. And that is what we did. And then I wound up narrating it, because when I wrote it, I didn't think I would be the narrator. But as I wrote it, I just kept hearing my own voice like a very natural thing. So I made this kids concert. It was a big success. It was all about rhythm. It was called the Bernstein Beat. Mm-hmm. And because it was about rhythm, that steered us to all the jumpingest Bernstein music that kids would like. And there was lots of audience participation, and a lot of orchestras picked it up. And then we got asked to write more concerts on different topics. So there was one about Copland, and then I went on writing other sorts of concerts for adult audiences as well. One on Stravinsky, one on Ravel, Mother Goose, one on all kinds of things. And after doing this for about 10, 15, 18, 20 years, I realized, oh my God, I guess this is my career, which didn't start until I was pretty close to 50 years old. Just goes to show you never know where life is going to steer you.
There's a lovely, beautiful section of the book that I'm not going to recount much, because I really want readers to go and read it, about how after we should say that your mother predeceased your father by a number of years. And when your father died, he lived in the Dakota, which is an historic building on West 72nd Street. And when he died, I lived down the street, actually. And how you and your brother and sister didn't want to let go of the apartment, because that was apartment 23, because that was your whole world and your family memories. And the Julia, the woman who took care of you, lived there. She was Chilean. And it was your parents' world, in effect. And how ultimately, though, for various reasons, you and your siblings decided that it was necessary to sell it. and how elsewhere, I won't say the building, in an historic building in New York City, a little closer to Carnegie Hall, you recreated a smaller version of some of that world, and Julia went to live there, so that you, three of you, were taking care of her, but also making it the place where the Leonard Bernstein office would exist. And the office part of his life and legacy continued there. And it's beautifully told in the book. So if you want to say something now about it, certainly feel free. But it was one of the passages that moved me the most.
Oh, well, I'm glad.
Yeah.
Yes. So we did finally pull up our socks, as our mother used to say, and sold the Dakota apartment. We knew we had to sell it. We didn't want to live in it.
Yeah.
And it was huge and expensive beyond belief. In the years that our parents lived there, the building sort of transformed from being full of artists to suddenly being full of millionaires, and because it had all suddenly gotten very upscale and unaffordable for a regular person in the arts. And we just couldn't carry that burden at all. So we did finally sell it. But what was Julia going to do? And so we did create this other apartment. And it comforted us because we saved some of the objects and furniture that we loved best in the Dakota and put them into this new, ever so much smaller apartment. And it became this kind of, living room, dining room, kitchen, social space that we could use for get-togethers and Christmas parties. And everybody could sort of get that Bernstein family vibe, because we had so many of our photographs in there, and there was a piano, of course, and all of that. Plus, it was my brother's office. And we had given Julia a place, a throne from which to rule the roost, because she was really the mater familias for our family. She was the CEO, and she was still, at this point, she was getting into her 80s, and she was still making hot lunches for Alexander every day. He gained many pounds in those years because he had to eat Julia's copious lunches. They were delicious, of course. Julia was a great cook. But in any case, this apartment served many purposes, and we still have it. But now it's kind of a problem because along came COVID, and it just sat there empty because Alexander wasn't going to his office. We were all hiding out, locked down, and doing everything on our computers, just like you and I are doing right now with all of our, listeners. It was all online all of a sudden. So this apartment has been going a-begging, and now we're trying to think hard about how and if to continue hanging on to it. We don't want to get rid of that one either. We're very bad at disassembling things.
I would encourage you to not get rid of it if that's possible, because number one, as the Bernstein children and family compound, but also because of the activities of your brother, who you describe in the book as having picked up the educational thread of your father. And would you talk about what he does? Because I think it's wonderful.
Oh, I would love to. I'm always, I leap at any opportunity to talk about what my brother has created. He went and got himself a master's in education and was a teacher himself for many years. And so what with one thing and the other, he had kind of the big picture about education. And he and my father used to talk a lot about such matters. And so Alexander had really absorbed a lot of our father's thoughts and philosophy about education. And so my brother wound up creating a learning model, a teaching model called artful learning. And it's not putting the arts into education. It's not just that. What it is using the arts and the creative impulse to infuse energy and connectedness into the entire school curriculum, so that every teacher in the school is connected to every other in the way that they're teaching. And the way they do this is to pick a big idea or a big word that they will all use in the process of teaching whatever they're teaching to the kids. So it connects, it's this holistic approach to teaching that connects everybody and makes everything more fun. And they invite the students to create works of art when the unit is reaching its conclusion. And this work of art has to express what it is that they've learned using, the big idea and the word. And the minute you express something personal from what you have learned, you don't forget what you learned.
Yeah.
And so this model works so well. And the scores go up in the student body, and the parents get involved because the parents love to help the kids with the art project. And pretty soon, this whole community is completely galvanized with all this creative energy. So that's what artful learning is. It's being used currently in many schools around the US. And if anybody wants to know more about it, go to artfullearning.org, and you can find out a lot more than what I just told you.
We have listeners today around the world, so they may not know about an American term, STEM, for education, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. All of that is fine, and I'm not against any of it, but I'm one of those people who advocates for STEAM, STEAM, with the arts. I realized once that we could make an anagram and it becomes meats, as in beef and veal, but I don't want to do meats. I'd rather do steam.
And it anagrams into teams because we all
thank you.
part of the same team.
There you go.
And mates and metas. And stop me.
No, those are wonderful, actually. I'll stick to steam for now because it gives, the essence, the vapor, the air, the luft to those sciences. Because I was telling you about my mother, who knew your father, and when she left Lincoln Center, she worked at Carnegie Hall for a while and then went into education and focused on special needs children and all kinds of challenges. And she pioneered teaching through the arts, as she called it, to use the arts to open up other issues that were closed to these children because they couldn't articulate or because they didn't fully understand what they were being oppressed with. And the arts opened doors because you could see a play or a film or look at a painting and suddenly come to understand that you shared with someone else whatever your challenge was. And so obviously I'm a big advocate for that, and I do want people to look up what your brother does. I asked you a while ago to send me a list of music that we might talk about. I need to post it online for people watching, so it will go up in a couple of days with the Adagio links. But one of the things, you mentioned 3 things that your father conducted. He conducted hundreds, if not thousands of works, but the Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz, one of my favorite composers, Stravinsky's Sacre du Printemps, and Mahler's Second Symphony Resurrection, the version done in Avery Fisher Hall, as Philharmonic Hall came to be called now, it's Geffen Hall, with Christa Ludwig and I believe Barbara Hendricks. I happened to attend all 4 of those performances because your father said you have to attend it, so I did. I would have anyway, but because I love that work. But it was there and then that I came to really love that work, because in the 4 performances which were recorded and then this Deutsche Grammophon recording was made, I discovered how different the work could be each time. And what was so instructive to me was not just the New York Philharmonic and the chorus and the soloists, but the way their energies pooled on different days. One, I think, was a Friday morning matinee or early afternoon, and that was a very different tireder performance, I can say, than the others.
I'm sure he'd been up very late the night before.
Yeah, because he conducted on Thursday night.
Right. A, he
Yeah.
conducted Mahler's second, and B, his adrenaline was probably exploding after the concert was over, and I'm sure he didn't get to sleep till 5 a.m.
Sure, and then he had to come back in and put
Do it
on his
again.
tux and do it again, or maybe a suit for the afternoon, and then Saturday night, and then the following Tuesday. And were you at any of those performances, and why did you particularly name that one?
Oh, I was there. I was there because I remember Barbara Hendricks and Christa Ludwig. And I just, well, I mean, Mahler clobbered me as a teenager, starting with the Fifth Symphony. That was the first one I was exposed to. No, that's not true, actually. It was the first one I heard live. But my introduction to Mahler was the Fourth Symphony on the Bruno Walter recording, which my father was listening to with the score in his lap to start learning the score, because he was going to conduct it the following season. And we were all by the swimming pool. So my father was sitting there with the score in his lap, and he's in his bathing suit, and my brother and I are splashing around in the pool. And he had brought down the portable stereo so that he could listen to the record and sit by the pool on a summer afternoon. And as the record was playing, he was, pointing out all the things, the kid-friendly things going on in the music. Oh, listen, you hear the sleigh bells? There's sleigh bells, just like on a horse clopping through the forest. And then he explained about, in the last movement, that the voice of the, it's the soprano being a child expressing her vision of heaven. So he was explaining what all of the words meant. And when I look back on this day, I think it's my own childhood vision of heaven. It was just so delish to be in the pool and have this music playing. So that was my introduction to Mahler. Then I heard Mahler 5 live at the Philharmonic, and it was devastating, fabulous. So by the time I heard Mahler second, I guess I'd had a few go-rounds with Mahler. But I think where I actually got to know Mahler second really well was in Europe, because my father was performing it over there, Ely Cathedral, or maybe it was before then. And going to rehearsals and hearing it more than once, that's how you get immersed in a piece, of course. And so I think that when I heard it at the Philharmonic, I didn't know it yet. And so it kind of swam over me the way a piece will when it's gigantic like that and you don't have any road markers. And in my efforts to share works of classical music with others, when I talk about music, I always try to give people a roadmap of the piece so that you're not having that experience that I had so often growing up, where the music would just tsunami over you and you can't really pick out the form or the content. And so if you have a little roadmap, this is something to listen for in the first part, and then this thing happens, and then in the second movement there's this, and then people have a sense of the shape.
That's what your father did.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
That's where I got it. It's totally where I got it.
It worked.
I unapologetically so. So yes. And so Mahler second eventually blossomed for me into a piece that I could understand somehow or have a picture of as it went by. But it took years because it's mighty.
Yes. When I first met him, I was 6. And for that period, not too long, I went by Freddie rather than Fred. And your father was one of the few people I allowed, to the end of our knowing one another, to call me Freddie. So that I remember at one point, probably 15, he said to me, Freddie, when you're going to be going to Europe, one thing you're going to have to do, and I want you to do this, and that line, I want you to do it, was, of course, the motivation. If Leonard Bernstein wants me to do it, I will do it.
Gotta do it.
To visit Mahler's 3 composer huts. And because Mahler, for people who don't know, was born in the Habsburg Empire, he lived in Vienna, he faced terrible anti-Semitism. And I'm making a very short biography of Mahler, after 10 years at the Vienna State Opera, conducted the New York Philharmonic for a long time and also did a lot of illustrious things at the Metropolitan Opera here in New York. And his third orchestra, let's call it, was the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam. And your father made many Mahler recordings with Vienna, with the Concertgebouw and the New York Philharmonic, and used the scores that Mahler had in the archive of the New York Philharmonic, with Mahler's markings as his point of departure for your father's own interpretation. But he said to me that, for example, the fourth was written on the Wörthersee, so that when you go to the composer hut on the Wörthersee, I want you to have the Fourth Symphony in your head. That Das Lied von der Erde was written in Toblach, in what is now Italy, Dobbiaco, but at that time it was part of the Austrian Empire. And that the first was written in his composer hut near Salzburg. And I don't know, did you ever go to these huts?
I never did. I know my father visited them all, but
because they're so inspiring. Because as it happened, when I went to the one on the Wörthersee, which is still part of Austria, very much so, in Carnia, or Carinthia, it's called in Austria, there was a huge downpour, huge. And I was the only person there, and I was trapped for like 2 hours. And I'm not complaining, because it's deep in the forest. It's not a fancy, it's a hut, really. It's a wooden structure that was basic and a place in nature for Mahler to compose and be inspired. And I suddenly realized that a downpour like that was both isolating but very liberating, because you were alone with the world, as Mahler would say. And I pictured your father in that lonely place. You described your father as gregarious and sociable and so on. One of the most beautiful pieces I think he ever wrote was the song Lonely Town, on the town, because it evokes loneliness so well. And so I thought of that plus the Mahler Fourth when I was in that composer hut. And that opened so many doors for, I'm not punning here, it opened many doors for me musically, creatively, and so on, to understand through your father Mahler's creative process by the places where he worked, because he would conduct the New York Philharmonic and the Met and then come back to Austria in the summer and not necessarily go to Vienna, but go to one of his three huts to compose and find the time, because he was a full-time working conductor and arts administrator and sometime pedagogue, in a way like your father, but in a way not like your father at all. And, you know, I'm very grateful to him for that, because I probably would have found these places anyway, but not with the context that he gave me.
Right, not with the specific instructions.
Yeah, it's true.
It's great.
It gave me a mission, in effect, as a way of finding my way into these works. You, among the recordings you listed, are ones where Leonard Bernstein was a performer, that he was a great pianist. And you list the Ravel Piano Concerto in G, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. It makes me wonder, did he ever encounter George Gershwin? He probably knew Ira.
I think he met Ira, but
yeah,
no, he was too young. And in fact, he was a counselor at his camp when it was announced over the radio that Gershwin had died.
Yeah.
And my father, in his very characteristic fashion, brought everyone to attention in the lunch cafeteria and announced that we had lost a great American musician, and we were all going to have a moment of silence, and then I'm going to this little rusty piano over here, and I'm going to play Rhapsody in Blue for you, which he did.
But then you mentioned the Beethoven Piano Concerto No. 1 as being very significant for you in
Because
regarding
I was in high school, I think, when my father had programmed it on the Philharmonic season, conducting from the piano. And he hadn't done that in years, so he really had to, brush up his Beethoven. And I heard him practicing through his studio door. His studio in the apartment we lived in was just down the corridor from my bedroom and my brother's bedroom and baby sister. So we could totally hear him banging away for hours, practicing all those runs. And of course, that meant that by the time I went to the concert and heard him perform it, I knew that piece by heart. And it's a wonderful piece, of course. And my father explained to me how Mozartian it was, and that because this was Beethoven's first piano concerto, he was still kind of partly in Mozart land, and he hadn't gotten all the way to developing his own idiosyncratic voice. But it also means, for that reason, that this piano concerto is so accessible and sunny, and it doesn't have that broody Beethovenian affect yet. And it's very user-friendly and kid-friendly, so I just loved it.
You also mentioned Aaron Copland. Did you meet and know Aaron Copland?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about Aaron Copland.
Oh, well, I love talking about Aaron Copland because we loved him. He was such a wonderful character. There was something about him that was simultaneously austere yet goofy. And, he had this incredibly goofy grin because he had these very prominent buck teeth and his big hook nose, right? And his little spectacles.
Glasses, yeah.
And then he had this hilarious goofy giggle. And so it was really fun to say something that would make Aaron laugh. And he loved a good laugh. He was full of fun and humor. He wasn't all the way to kid-friendly somehow. He wouldn't play with us exactly, but we just so enjoyed when he would, come to our house in Connecticut for lunch, let's say, or would come for dinner. But my best memories of Aaron are his coming here to where I am now, to our family house in Connecticut, and just hang out for the day and have lunch. And it's like beautiful weather and everybody's relaxed and that goofy giggle. So he was just delicious. And I think one of the big reasons that we looked forward to him as much as we did is because it was so obvious how much our parents were looking forward to Aaron's visit. They adored him, both of them. They just adored him and he adored them. And so there was just this happy feeling whenever Aaron was around. And that lasted for years, but not all the way to the end of his life because of his dementia. It was just so sad when he started losing it and you couldn't access him anymore,
I think it's so interesting that your father, who was 18 years younger than Aaron Copland, if I remember, and Copland were these lefty Jewish composers who, in their music, for many people, personified what we think of as America. Perhaps your father, more urban, edgy, comedic, ironic version. Copland, the more idealistic, although your father could be plenty idealistic, pastoral kind of America. Do you know if they ever discussed the fact that they were the guys who represented America, even though they were politically and religiously and culturally apart from much of the country?
What a great question. It's a great question. And I think we can include Gershwin in this group as well. Although obviously he was before, so my father never met him. They didn't talk about anything.
And to my knowledge, not as political.
No, as far as I know, he wasn't that political, but he did the same thing that Copland and Bernstein did, which was to kind of invent American sounding music. And Gershwin did it by infusing jazz and blues into his music. And then Copland did it in this totally other way I'm so fascinated by the way Copland was heading in one direction compositionally, and then he consciously and deliberately changed direction in order to make his music more populistic. He did it on purpose because he was a lefty, and because he was part of that whole movement in the 30s called the Popular Front. And in those days, coming out of the Depression, the whole idea was to make the arts available to everybody. And so Copland very consciously invented this way of composing where the music was expressing something about America itself, and he turned to the West. Mm-hmm. And I have this fantastic illustration, this drawing in my studio in New York that was part of the visual materials for a kids concert I invented called Cowboys, Caballeros, and Copland. And it's all about the cowboy music and the Mexican music.
El Salón Mexico, yeah.
Yes. And so the drawing is of Aaron Copland with his beaky nose and his little spectacles, riding a nice bucking bronco out in the Wild West with the cactus behind him. And it's just so improbable, right? But it's one of my favorite little drawings in a frame. But anyway, so Copland came up with this, the wide open spaces music, and also all the Mexican music. So, he made all that be an expression of America. And then my dad did all of those things and more when he, especially in West Side Story, where he combined Latin Caribbean music to represent the Sharks with bebop jazz to represent the Jets, and then had, the two flavors of music clashing with each other, just like the gangs were clashing. It was just so damn brilliant. But, again, he found a way to invent American sounding music. So, it's amazing how that progressed. Who do you think has come along since those three who came up with a new and different flavor of American music that we can point to?
That could be called American music? No one quite. There are many forms of music that have come forth and continue to. And in your book, you wrote about your father sort of having an opening late in his life to hip hop, but sort of.
Yes, we have suppressed his attempt to write hip-hop.
I know. But he was always interested in the new. And he was interested in rock and roll. And I remember his talking a lot about rock and roll, especially the Beatles, in my experience, and about the musical progressions in Paul McCartney, especially more than the lyrics, and to a lesser degree, John Lennon. So, I mean, obviously it begs the question, your father and John Lennon lived in the same building. Did they talk music? I know that you idolized John Lennon, but did your father and John Lennon talk music?
Not really. They didn't hang, They didn't hang. I wish they had.
I wish they had, yeah.
They were warm and polite neighbors, but I don't think it ever came to more than that. What I really regret is that my father never followed through on his idea to set John Lennon's poetry to music. He was really interested in doing that. So much so that it led to an opportunity for us to meet the Beatles when I was 12 years old, and in the absolute height of my obsession with the Beatles and John Lennon. And we got to, this, as you know, is in my book. We got to meet them in their dressing room when they came back to do the Ed Sullivan Show a second time.
You mean Ape Solomon?
Ape Solomon, yes. As
the family described him.
Yes, exactly. Good memory.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, we all adored and admired and respected John Lennon, and my father and I were both there the night he was killed outside the building. That it was one of the most horrific nights of my life, I heard the shotgun blast. I mean, not
Yeah.
shotgun, revolver. I heard the gunshot.
I lived at 112 West 72nd Street at the time. So I
Oh, right
remember
across the street, pretty much.
Yeah, I remember all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah. So I want to go back a little bit to another composition of your father's that influenced me greatly, but not immediately. I was an early follower of the plays, of the autobiographies, which some people called fictional, of Lillian Hellman, who your dachshund Henry despised, apparently. I know Henry peed on the pillow. He peed on the pillow. Did he ever pee on Lillian Hellman?
Well, no, he preferred to chew her ankle. Every time she came to the house, he would just go for Lillian's ankle. He hated, you know, like he hated her. He just hated Lillian Hellman. And you know what else he did, which I take as a sign of canine intelligence? He chewed up her photograph he chewed up the frame. And like, how did dogs aren't supposed to be able to recognize people without their scent, certainly. But somehow he chewed up her picture too.
I say this because Candide, the novel by Voltaire, is my second favorite novel of all. Don Quixote is the first. And it profoundly influenced me as a kid growing up, reading that, and then hearing of Candide as written by Lillian Hellman and your father in the original 1956 version. My father adored it. Any music my father adored, I came to learn very well. But I didn't get to see a production until relatively late, because it was a period when it just wasn't done that often. And then when it was done in a revised book. And only later on did some of Lillian Hellman's original work come into it. For people who don't know, Lillian Hellman wrote very famous plays, Watch on the Rhine, The Little Foxes, among others. She too was deeply political. She was Jewish from New Orleans, very complicated person, a legend to some, despised by others. Jane Fonda played her in a film called Julia, that apparently people say the whole story of Julia was fictionalized, even though Lillian Hellman purported to be true. But Hellman was a formidable figure, and apparently not the warmest person. There are very funny quotes in your book about her. But the operetta Candide has really become very close to my heart. And not only for the famous overture, but because to me, you were talking earlier about being an adult as opposed to being a child, and the journey from childhood, which can be awful or wonderful, or usually somewhere in between, to adulthood, which may have seemed idyllic, but is much more complex and frustrating. And the more I live and grow with the operetta Candide, I come to understand more about human life. And it's a very beautiful work. And I love the music, and I love the humor when it happens. And I love the resilience of the characters. Anything you want to say about Candide the operetta, about your father and it, and Lillian Hellman and it, or any of the subsequent versions, including the recording, which I remember well?
Right. Well, you know, that the original cast album from Broadway, right? Mm-hmm. It was the president of Columbia Records, Goddard Lieberson, who had the idea that this show should be recorded. And because he insisted upon that, that's really what preserved Candide in the world, because people loved that record so much it became a kind of cult classic. And that's what really kept it in the world. I'm going to try and condense my remarks, because I could talk about Candide all the live long day, because it's so fascinating and so multifaceted. But anyway, Lillian-wise, she was the one who had the original idea to turn Voltaire's novella into a show, a musical. And she talked my dad into doing it. And it took them a long time. It took like 4 years, and it was kind of torture. It was a very difficult project. And, you know, many collaborators came and went, including after they were done, as you know, with all those new versions. And Lillian had never written a musical before. I don't think she had the first clue about how to do it. And she never tried it again. I think she was really out of her element. And her whole impetus for doing it was really to make fun of the House Un-American Activities Committee during the big communist witch hunts of the 1950s, which is when they wrote the show. And she thought that there was a fantastic parallel to be made with the Spanish Inquisition. And that was really what spurred the writing of the whole thing.
What a day for an auto da fe.
Exactly. What a day for an auto da fe. Anyway, but all this material making fun of the House Un-American Activities Committee was so pointed that the director of the musical, Tyrone Guthrie, got nervous. He lost his gumption, and he made Lillian take most of that stuff out while the show was still out of town. So by the time it opened on Broadway, most of the really scabrous, pointed stuff had been removed. And that was just the beginning of the removals.
Yeah.
And then later on, and so the book had so many problems, and everybody observed that. And it was the reason it was so hard to put on, and it was also the reason that it had so many later incarnations. And was it in 1972 that they did the so-called Chelsea theater version?
Around that time, that's when I first saw it, yeah.
Okay, so that was way cut down, and it was made much kickier and much sort of zanier. And, you know, all that heavy stuff was completely removed. And Lillian was so horrified at what they had done to Candide that she officially and forevermore took her name off the work. Mm-hmm. So Lillian Hellman, I mean, and the irony, I think, is that Lillian Hellman's political ferocity, her rage and her intensity was what spurred her to write Candide in the first place. But it was that same intensity and rage that moved her to take her name off the piece.
Yeah.
You know, that was so Lillian. She was so radical about everything.
Yeah, but I respected that. I mean, she was not easy, but I respected that she was very passionate about her politics. And, you know, I forget the exact term, I will paraphrase, that she said in the McCarthy era, but then subsequently, that she will not tailor her opinions to this year's fashion.
She said it to the committee because she was subpoenaed to testify in front of that committee. And she did. And they were trying to get her to name names, which an awful lot of other artistic people did do, including Jerome Robbins, to the everlasting disgust of his collaborators. But anyway, when they asked Lillian, she said, "I cannot and will not cut my political cloth to fit this year's fashions." I think that was the line. I mean, good for her. Yeah. So she may have made up some of her memoir material, but in other ways, she was completely authentically true blue Lee herself, you know?
And her book Pentimento is a wonderful book. It was very influential on me early on. I know that we are time conscious, and I stick to the time. It's kind of like when we have unions at the rehearsal, and Maestro could be conducting the most beautiful Beethoven Ninth Symphony. And
yeah, it was the bane of my father's existence that they would get up mid-bar.
Yeah. And
just leave. Oh, he hated that so much.
But I want to bring up just a couple of other things, four other things. I have them in my head. One is, as we just discussed, he was famously political and proud of it, and whether it was supporting President Kennedy, his, I'll call it belief in Israel and the better aspects of Judaism and what that could bring. And that's a whole other topic, the Candide Symphony and so forth. He wrote an essay for the New York Times on October 30th, 1988 called "I'm a Liberal and Proud of It," that I think should just go into every textbook, because he explained.
Good luck with that.
I know, but you know,
Yeah.
because it became a curse word, and liberal democracy, and Britain and Italy liberals are not necessarily the most left-wing people. It's a viewpoint, it's a worldview that encompasses and believes in knowledge and wisdom and charity and benevolence and so on. So I would love if people can go back to the New York Times. You kindly sent it to me and I reread it. October 30th, 1988. It's just perfect.
You can post the link to the archive on Idagio on the
I will do that.
Dashboard.
And I want to mention, by the way, that Jamie did a series for Idagio in June called The Lenny Lens, Bernstein's Embrace of Music, which people can go back and find and watch, and it's pretty wonderful. I'm working on a comparable thing about Verdi. I didn't know Verdi, but for Idagio that will be coming soon. The next thing I want to talk about is sensitive, but you deal with it from the very beginning of your book, is smoking and the whole world of tobacco and cigarettes in your parents' life, in your social lives, and the environment of the time, but especially your father, who I remember was always had a cigarette working, another one in an ashtray. How did you experience that all the time, and what was it like?
Well, this is, I deliberately put in a lot of stuff about smoking in the course of my book, because it was absolutely a part of our physical environment. And I talk about like how gross it was when one of our parents would light up in the car, especially if it was winter and you couldn't just open all the windows. And that first puff after lighting the cigarette was so smelly and gross. I would try to hold my breath so I wouldn't smell it, but I always had to breathe eventually, and then I would have to breathe it in. And every flat surface in our house had an ashtray on it, and a couple of cigarette butts. It was just ubiquitous everywhere. And I deliberately, put in all those details in the course of the book, because eventually, of course, both my parents died of lung cancer, and they were both absolute inveterate, devoted smokers. My mother smoked Chesterfields. They didn't even have a filter.
Right.
Later on, she changed brands and she used a thing called an aqua filter, which was this rather elegant little white cigarette filter that was supposed to, pull out all the toxins. Yeah, that really worked. But anyway, and both my parents used the aqua filter.
Yes.
But as we say in the tribe, garnished helfen.
True. There's a passage that you describe in the book that I want readers to go to. His very last concert. By the way, part of why I asked you for this week is that Leonard Bernstein's birthday is this week, August 25th.
Coming right up.
And that's part of why. And he died not too long after his last concert, which was in Tanglewood in Massachusetts with the Boston Symphony. He was a Bostonian originally, although he's buried in Brooklyn. And he had no breath left, and you describe it so well. And I have this recording that's available of the Britten Sea Pictures and the Beethoven Seventh Symphony. And rather than describe it, I want people to read your description, but to understand the devastation that tobacco and lung cancer and mesothelioma and so forth can do. But also because that recording is so treasurable for all kinds of other reasons, sad though it is.
Yes.
Marilyn Horne, who is a friend, tells a story of the time working with your father when the famous recording of West Side Story was done with opera singers. You recount the famous parts of that in your book about Jose Carreras, about Kiri Te Kanawa battling a cold, and Tatiana Troyanos, who was a great Anita. But the original person who was supposed to sing somewhere was Jesse Norman. And apparently they had recorded the musical tracks, and Jesse Norman was supposed to come into the studio to record it. Ultimately, she did not. And your father called Marilyn, who lived on 66th Street, right nearby,
There.
and asked her to come in, and she brought the music and she sang it. But he was in the studio with her in a little booth near the microphone, conducting her, and I'm coughing thinking about it, with the musical tracks, listening to it. And he was smoking and blowing smoke into Marilyn's face. So when I listened to her sing, "There's a Place for Us," all I can picture is smoke going into her face.
It's unbelievable. Like the heedlessness of it.
I know. And it's sad. And I mean, I hope that people now reading this take this as a caution about.
I hope. I mean, you know, the world in general came around to not acknowledging the toxicity of cigarette smoking, but plenty of people still smoke. So what do I know?
And my final question, although I know we could do this, we could take it on the road. Does the name Richard Horowitz have any meaning for you? Or Dick Horowitz?
Yeah. Who is Dick Horowitz again? I know that name.
Horowitz, when I was performance manager of the Metropolitan Opera, I came to know Dick, was the longest serving employee in the history of the Metropolitan Opera.
Oh, I know. He was the timpanist who made the batons for my dad, right?
Yes. And your father commissioned Dick to make these batons. And am I correct that your father was buried with one of these batons?
Yeah.
Yes.
And a bunch of other stuff too. His score of Mahler 5.
Yes.
And his copy of Alice in Wonderland.
I didn't know that. I knew about the Mahler 5 and one of Dick's batons. But Carl Böhm commissioned Dick Horowitz, and all kinds of other people commissioned Dick. He was a very dear friend of mine, as was his still alive wife, Bernice, who's 100.
Wow.
And my mother's name is Bernice, and our families became very close. And when my mother had a major birthday 10 years ago, Dick asked me, "What would your mother like?" And my mother knew Lenny and loved Lenny and loved Dick and his wife Bernice. And I suggested a Leonard Bernstein baton. And to my knowledge, it's the last one he made that is actually a Leonard Bernstein baton. And I went and found it. I'm going to handle it with great care. Dick says, "Open this end from R.S. Horowitz to Bernice," is my mother. And I'm going to handle it with great care.
Wow, this is amazing.
And apparently your father liked champagne corks. And so Dick used champagne corks that apparently your father consumed, because he was very specific about which cork to use. And it says on here, I'm going to read it and then show it to you. November 24th, 2012, a Leonard Bernstein baton, R. Horowitz.
Wow.
And I don't know if you could see the writing. I'll try to bring it close.
Yes, I can see it.
Yep.
That's fantastic. That is such a collector's item, Fred.
It is.
You could sell that on eBay for... No,
I'm not selling it.
I'm kidding.
Yeah, I know.
But that's a fantastic thing to have.
I mention this because your father's influence and reach, and, you know, the way we think of him and learn from him, and the way you and your siblings carry on his legacy, is something incredibly important, not just for culture, although that is super important, but about what is important in life and how we live our lives and what we devote ourselves to. And no one's perfect, but we are given one chance. That to me is what Candide is about.
Yeah.
And to me, your father and mother, who I didn't know that well, I met her, but I didn't really know her that well. And the legacy they gave to their children including Famous Father Girl, is something really to be deeply proud of. And I'm so honored that you joined me today for this conversation.
Oh, the honor's mine.
Jamie Bernstein.
Thank
And
you.
I hope to see you again.
I
This
bet
has
you
been
will in
great.
the neighborhood.
I would love that. And then we'll catch up on all kinds of other stories.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
You
So long to
too.
everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Enjoy the rest of the summer.